We will now move to the other side, and this time we will begin with Ms. Cooper. The statistics in Allegheny County show that arrests and convictions for drugs and driving under the influence account for the majority of cases, and there are mandatory sentences for all DUI and some drug cases, depending on weight. What is your thought on mandatory sentencing?
I am not a fan of mandatory sentencing. I think it takes the human element out of the judicial system. I think there are better ways to treat people with drug and alcohol issues than to throw them in jail. Now, some may need to go to jail, but I don't think that's everyone. And I think you really need to take it on a case-to-case basis. And as a practical matter, I think we waste a lot of public resources imprisoning people as opposed to giving them help. And so I think at the outset, people should be are given an opportunity for help before we rush to incarcerate them.
And we'll continue to the right. We'll move on to the right. Yeah.
I don't think you'll find any judge who would be supportive of mandatory minimums taking the discretion away from them. So I mean, I would say certainly as a judge you would not be supportive. And I would agree with you. It's that you're standing before somebody or someone's standing before you. You want to have a little bit of discretion of your own. So that's what I would say.
I'm not a supporter of mandatory sentences. I learned, though, when I studied sentencing in law school from one of the nation's experts on sentencing policy, that sentencing guidelines are very important for a justice system. Before we had systems that included guidelines for sentencing, you could have completely disparate sentences for the same crimes depending on where you were. Justice by geography. No good. So to my mind, what makes most sense is a system that gives ranges, guidelines, that a judge has the discretion to depart from either up or down based on individual circumstances.
And we will continue, just make a full circle. Mr. Tranquilli.
Yeah, working at the DA's office, we've created some specialty courts. We have DUI court, we have drug court, we have veterans court, we have mental health court, and I think that reflects, the mentality that we've developed as prosecutors, at least for the 20 years that I've been in the DA's office, that, you need to have specialized courts for specialized problems. And people don't commit crimes for no reason. A lot of them, they have fundamental, at the root cause, they have alcohol or drug dependency, and I think by and large those courts are moving in the right direction. I'm not in favor of mandatory sentencing because I think it takes away the individual element. As Ms. Bush indicated, however, we all have to be on the same page. We have to be constrained at least by the same ranges. That's why we have a mitigated range, a standard range, and an aggravated range for every crime on a grid based on the person's prior record and on the offense gravity score or the severity of the crime that's committed. So I think that within those confines, that's a pretty safe bet. I think we can still get the standardization there.
I'm not in favor of mandatory sentencing either. I concur with my colleagues. I think there should be a guideline system in place to give a judge some discretion. I think it's a case by case under the circumstances how a person will be sentenced. If they're a repeat offender, obviously that's something that would be considered. There are programs in place. There's the Renewal Center, the program for female offenders that address some of the overcrowding and some of the lesser offenses for drugs and alcohol and so forth. And there are programs to help reach out to these folks so they don't become repeat offenders. Thank you.
I don't believe in mandatory sentencing, and I think that even with guidelines, I think judges should be permitted to deviate from those up or down depending on their individual discretion and the facts of the case. I agree that the specialty courts are necessary to address the root problem of the individual perpetrators so that we cure them so they're not back in the system again, and to the extent possible, help them move on, be in a better part of their life.
I agree that the sentence needs to be tailored to the individual, and of course, if the judge is departing from the guidelines, that there should be a good, clear reason stated, therefore, but that the best sentence is one tailored to the individual.
I don't believe in mandatory sentencing, but the judge's belief isn't what rules the day. It's what the law and the legislator wrote. Unfortunately, these mandatory sentencing laws are the laws, and judges have obligations to enforce the laws. Whether you're a fan or not a fan, you have to interpret the law as it's written.
I'm against mandatory sentence. I think that a judge, after he hears all the facts, should be able to make a decision as to the sentence. And I do agree, we do have sentencing guidelines, and as Mr. Tranquilli said, and if the judge wants to deviate, he can deviate from it. Now, the problem I have with mandatory sentencing is most of the time, a mandatory really isn't a mandatory because a district attorney can waive the mandatory usually. And what happens is that you're faced with a case. I'm a criminal defense attorney. I do a lot of criminal defense. You're faced with a district like a drug case telling you that there's a 3-year mandatory. If you want to try it, I'm going to go for 3 years. But if you want to plea, I'll give you 11 after 23 months. And I think that's improper because it's forcing the person to plead guilty to something that he really should have a trial. So I think mandatory sentences are bad. But I agree with my colleague that as a judge, I have to interpret the law, and whatever the legislature passed, I have to follow.
Our next round of questioning will begin. Oh, I'm sorry. Wow, that's the downside. Sitting right next to me. I'm sorry.
I don't believe in mandatory sentencing, and I think that it removes the discretion from the court. I understand a need to regularize what decisions are so there's some consistency, but I do not believe in mandatory sentencing. I'll apply the laws the legislature provides us with it, but I wish somebody would go to the legislature and talk to them.
I've actually dealt with this issue head on, and I've opposed mandatories in federal court in cases like U.S. versus Hamlin, U.S. versus Mangan. Those are some cases that I've had. I've dealt with it in the context of bringing people back from prison for resentencing post-Booker. And you can't really say as a judge that you don't believe in mandatory sentences because they're there. There's something to, you have to believe in them, and you have to apply them. I think the DA's office has done a very good job of putting together some diversionary dispositions that can help people avoid that. And unfortunately, no judge wants to not have discretion, but mandatory sentences have to be applied, and that's really a legislative issue.